When Marine veteran David Hayes thought the worst enemy he'd face on the isolated Maine coast would be the brutal Atlantic storms, he couldn't have been more wrong. Standing in the shadow of the crumbling Beacon Point Lighthouse he'd just purchased for $800, his faithful German Shepherd companion Ranger began exhibiting behavior that chilled David to the bone. The dog wasn't reacting to the howling winds or crashing waves that had battered this forsaken stretch of coastline for over a century. Instead, Ranger's intense focus was locked on the lighthouse's ancient stone foundation, scratching and whining with an urgency that spoke of secrets buried deeper than any storm could reach. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. David understood immediately that his four-legged partner wasn't showing fear, but issuing a warning. What could be hidden beneath centuries-old stone that only his dog's heightened senses could detect? A truth that someone had been willing to kill to keep buried for over 2 decades. He knew without question that he had to trust his most loyal companion and uncover whatever darkness lay waiting in the depths of Beacon Point. The salty air hung thick and oppressive in the cramped meeting room of the Cumberland County Administrative Building, carrying with it the mingled scents of old coffee, damp wool coats, and the faint underlying brine that seemed to permeate everything within 50 miles of the Maine coast. It was the unmistakable smell of bureaucratic neglect mixed with maritime decay, an atmosphere that David Hayes had hoped to leave behind when he'd traded his military uniform for civilian clothes 6 months ago. He sat rigidly on a hard plastic chair near the back of the room, his posture reflecting the discipline that had been drilled into him over 15 years in the United States Marine Corps. His eyes, however, were not focused on the auctioneer droning on at the front of the room, but instead gazed through the salt-stained window toward the gray expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, stretching endlessly toward the horizon. At his feet, maintaining the same quiet dignity that had made him invaluable during 2 tours of duty, lay Ranger. The German Shepherd was a magnificent specimen, though his distinctive coloring always drew curious stares and questions from strangers. Unlike the typical black and tan markings of his breed, Ranger's thick double coat displayed a striking combination of deep charcoal, silver and cream that created an almost wolf-like appearance in certain light. At 8 years old, he bore the distinguished bearing of a veteran himself, having served alongside David in some of the most dangerous regions of Afghanistan. His muzzle showed the first hints of gray, and his intelligent brown eyes held a depth of understanding that seemed almost human in its intensity. Ranger was far more than a companion animal. He was David's anchor to the present moment, the silent guardian of his peace of mind, and the only living being who truly understood the weight of memories they both carried. David himself was a man shaped by service and hardship, his 38 years evident in the lines around his watchful green eyes and the premature silver threading through his dark brown hair. His face told the story of a life lived with purpose, marked by a thin white scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, a permanent reminder of an IED explosion that had changed everything. He wore his civilian uniform of choice, a simple navy blue Henley shirt under a worn but clean leather jacket, dark jeans that had seen better days, and sturdy hiking boots built for function rather than fashion. Everything about his appearance spoke to practicality and preparedness, the habits of a man who had learned that survival often depended on being ready for anything at a moment's notice. The auctioneer, a heavy-set man whose voice carried the nasal quality of someone who had been doing this job for far too many years, mechanically worked his way through the day's offerings. A collection of seized assets, tax-delinquent properties, and municipal cast-offs that represented the financial failures and forgotten dreams of others. For each item, the same predictable dance would unfold as a handful of local speculators and bargain hunters would engage in brief bidding wars before someone walked away with their prize. David had been waiting patiently for over 2 hours, ignoring the suspicious glances from the handful of locals who recognized him as an outsider. He had come here with a specific purpose, drawn by a single entry he had discovered buried deep in the county records during a visit to the clerk's office the previous week. The entry had been so brief and unremarkable that it seemed almost deliberately obscured, as if someone had tried to make it as unnoticeable as possible. The auctioneer cleared his throat and adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses before consulting his clipboard. His voice took on a distinctly different tone, one that seemed to drain the already limited enthusiasm from his delivery. Next item up for bid is Lot 17, the Beacon Point Lighthouse property. This includes the lighthouse structure itself, the keeper's quarters foundation, and approximately 12 acres of coastal land. A palpable shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. It was not a sound so much as a feeling, a collective holding of breath that seemed to suck the energy out of the space. The quiet murmur of conversation that had provided a constant background noise throughout the morning suddenly ceased, leaving only the distant sound of waves crashing against the rocky shore outside. David felt the weight of every pair of eyes in the room turning toward him, the only stranger present. He had made inquiries about the property during his visit to the county office, asking questions that had been met with uncomfortable silences and nervous glances between the staff members. They knew exactly why he was here, and their expressions made it clear they thought he was making a terrible mistake. The auctioneer continued reading from his notes, his voice now completely devoid of any sales pitch or enthusiasm. The property comes to the county through tax delinquency proceedings. The structure is listed in poor condition and is sold strictly as is, where is, with no warranties or representations. Access is via private road, condition unknown. Utilities status unknown. The property has been vacant for approximately 22 years. 22 years. The number seemed to echo in the stale air of the meeting room, hanging there like a ghost. For more than 2 decades, this lighthouse had sat empty and forgotten, slowly surrendering to the relentless assault of Maine's harsh coastal weather. It was an extraordinary length of time for any property to remain in bureaucratic limbo, especially one sitting on prime oceanfront real estate. David raised his hand in a calm, deliberate gesture. $800. His voice carried clearly through the silence, strong and unwavering despite the dozens of eyes now focused intently upon him. The auctioneer's gaze found his, and David could see a flicker of something that might have been pity cross the man's weathered features. "I have $800 from the gentleman in the back. Do I hear 900? The silence that followed was profound and unsettling. It was not the competitive pause that had punctuated the earlier auctions, where bidders sized each other up and calculated their next moves. This was something deeper and more troubling, a silence heavy with unspoken warnings and shared knowledge that David was not party to. Ranger lifted his head from where he had been resting quietly at David's feet, his ears swiveling as he sensed the change in the room's emotional temperature. The dog's brown eyes swept across the faces of the other attendees, reading the subtle signs of tension and unease that even his human companion might have missed. David placed a steadying hand on Ranger's broad head, feeling the familiar comfort of the dog's solid presence. He looked around the room, taking in the faces of the locals who had been bidding aggressively on every other item throughout the morning. Fishermen in weather-beaten work clothes, real estate speculators in slightly rumpled business attire, and bargain hunters who seemed to attend these auctions as a form of entertainment. Not one of them looked envious that they might be missing out on a waterfront property being offered at an absurdly low price. Instead, their expressions ranged from concerned to fearful, as if they were watching a man walk willingly toward the edge of a cliff. Going once, the auctioneer called out, his voice rushing through the formality, as if he wanted to complete this particular transaction as quickly as possible. He scanned the room one final time, giving every potential bidder a chance to enter the competition. David held the gaze of a local woman in the front row, someone whose sun-weathered face and calloused hands spoke of a lifetime spent working on or near the water. She gave him an almost imperceptible shake of her head, a final silent warning that whatever he thought he was buying, the reality was far more complicated and dangerous. Going twice, the auctioneer announced, his gavel already raised in preparation for the final blow that would seal the transaction. The room seemed to hold its collective breath, as if everyone present was waiting for David to come to his senses and withdraw his bid. But David Hayes was not a man who backed down from challenges, especially when his instincts told him that there was more to this story than met the eye. He had learned to trust those instincts during his years of military service, where the ability to read between the lines and detect hidden dangers had often meant the difference between life and death. Sold. The gavel came down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo like a gunshot in the silent room, finalizing a transaction that everyone present seemed to believe was a terrible mistake. As David made his way to the front of the room to complete the paperwork and hand over the cash payment, the dam of silence finally broke. The room erupted in a low buzz of whispered conversations, fragments of which reached his ears as he walked past the rows of concerned faces. "Doesn't have any idea what he's gotten himself into," someone muttered from his left. "That lighthouse has been trouble since day one," came another voice from behind him. 22 years, and there's a reason nobody's wanted to touch it," observed a third speaker. The clerk who processed his payment was a nervous young man who seemed barely out of college, his hands actually trembling slightly as he prepared the deed transfer documents. He refused to make eye contact with David, instead focusing intently on the paperwork as if the legal documents might provide some protection against whatever curse or misfortune was associated with the property. When the clerk finally pushed the deed across the table toward David, he did so with obvious reluctance, as if the document itself were contaminated with something toxic. "You'll need to sign here, and initial there," he said in a voice barely above a whisper, still avoiding David's eyes. David signed the documents with calm precision, his signature bold and confident despite the atmosphere of doom and gloom that permeated the entire transaction. He folded the deed carefully and placed it in the inside pocket of his leather jacket, next to his heart. The whole experience left a bitter taste in his mouth, but it did not shake his resolve. He had faced down armed insurgents in mountain caves halfway around the world.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Whispered warnings and fearful looks from small-town locals were not going to deter him from his chosen path. With the deed to his new life secured in his jacket pocket, David led Ranger out of the administrative building and into the crisp Maine air. The salt breeze immediately cleared the stale atmosphere of bureaucratic anxiety from his lungs, replacing it with the clean, honest smell of the ocean. He had some preparations to make before heading out to inspect his new property, and he wanted to get a better sense of what he had walked into by talking to some of the locals. The sign hanging over the door of Morrison's Marine Supply had been weathered by decades of coastal storms, its paint faded and peeling, but still legible enough to identify the establishment as the kind of place where serious mariners came for their needs. The bell above the door chimed with a clear nautical note as David entered, Ranger padding silently beside him. The interior of the store was a maze of maritime equipment, from heavy-duty rope and marine electronics to weather gear and emergency supplies. The air smelled of canvas, rope, and the distinctive odor of marine-grade lubricants. Behind the counter stood a man who appeared to be in his 60s, his face deeply tanned and lined from a lifetime spent on or near the water. His thick gray beard was neatly trimmed, and his blue eyes held the steady, measuring gaze of someone who had seen more than his share of storms. "Afternoon," the man said, his voice carrying the distinctive Maine accent that David was still getting used to. "What can I do for you?" David approached the counter, pulling out a list he had prepared during his research into the lighthouse property. "I need some basic supplies. Heavy-duty flashlights, marine batteries, some rope, and if you have them, tide charts for the Beacon Point area." The proprietor, whose name tag identified him as Earl Morrison, began gathering the requested items with practiced efficiency. As he worked, he studied David with the frank curiosity of someone who had been serving the maritime community long enough to spot newcomers immediately.
You wouldn't happen to be the fellow who just bought the old Beacon Point light, would you? Earl asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. Word travels fast, David replied simply, neither confirming nor denying the assumption. Earl paused in his gathering of supplies, leaning against the counter with an expression that had grown suddenly serious. Son, I hope you don't mind an old salt's interference, but there are some things you ought to know before you head out there. David had expected this conversation, just as he had anticipated the reaction at the auction. He set down the coil of rope he had been examining and gave Earl his full attention. I'm listening. Earl glanced around the store, confirming they were alone, except for Ranger, who had stationed himself near the door in his characteristic alert posture. That lighthouse, Earl began, dropping his voice to a more confidential tone. It belonged to the Coast Guard until the early 90s. Then it got decommissioned when they automated all the navigation systems. The property was supposed to be sold to developers, turned into some fancy resort or condos. He moved to the window, gazing out toward the distant coastline where David's new property lay hidden among the rocky headlands. But there was a problem. The last keeper, a man named Thomas Whitmore, disappeared right before the decommissioning was finalized, just vanished without a trace. His truck was found in the parking area, keys still in the ignition, but he was never seen again. Earl returned to the counter, his weathered hands fidgeting with a piece of marine rope as he continued his story. Because Whitmore had no family in the area, and his legal status was uncertain, the property got tangled up in all kinds of legal proceedings. Federal bureaucracy at its finest. The Coast Guard couldn't complete the sale, the county couldn't take possession for taxes, and the whole thing just sat there in limbo for years. David absorbed this information, filing it away with the growing collection of facts he was accumulating about his new property. What happened to break the deadlock? Time mostly, Earl replied with a slight shrug. Eventually the federal government just walked away from it, declared it surplus property and dumped it on the county to deal with. That's when the tax bills started piling up. For over a decade, nobody knew who was supposed to be paying them, so they just accumulated. Earl pulled out a nautical chart from under the counter, spreading it out so David could see the coastal features around Beacon Point. Here's the thing that really bothers folks around here, he said, pointing to the lighthouse's position on the chart. That stretch of coast has always been dangerous. Ships have been running aground on those rocks for centuries, but since Whitmore disappeared, there have been more incidents. Boats that should know better, experienced captains who've been navigating these waters their whole lives, suddenly finding themselves in trouble near Beacon Point. David studied the chart, noting the numerous hazard markings and warning symbols clustered around the rocky peninsula where his lighthouse stood. Are you suggesting the lighthouse is somehow responsible for these accidents? Earl shook his head quickly. I'm not suggesting anything supernatural, if that's what you're thinking, but I am saying that people around here have learned to give that place a wide berth. The coast there has always been tricky, but it's gotten worse. Maybe it's changing currents, maybe it's erosion affecting the underwater rocks, or maybe, he trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. Maybe what? David prompted. Earl rolled up the chart and handed it to David along with his other supplies. Maybe some places are just meant to be left alone. That's all I'm saying. David paid for his purchases, noting that Earl's pricing was fair and honest, despite the ominous warnings that came with the transaction. As he prepared to leave, Earl called out one final piece of advice. If you're determined to go through with this, son, I'd suggest you be very careful about that access road. It hasn't been maintained in over 20 years, and the spring storms have been particularly hard on the coastal areas this year. You might find the way in more difficult than you expect. David thanked Earl for both the supplies and the warnings, then headed back outside where the afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the small coastal town. He loaded his purchases into the back of his pickup truck, a reliable 2010 Ford F-150 that had served him well since his discharge from the Marines. As he drove out of town toward the coastal road that would eventually lead him to Beacon Point, David reflected on the pattern of warnings and discouragement he had encountered. The auction where locals treated his successful bid like a death sentence, Earl's carefully worded but unmistakably dire warnings about the property's history, the repeated emphasis on the lighthouse being abandoned, dangerous, and somehow cursed. It all felt too orchestrated, too consistent to be merely the product of small-town superstition. David's military experience had taught him to recognize the difference between genuine concern and manufactured fear, and something about the reactions he was encountering suggested the latter. Someone, somewhere, had a vested interest in keeping people away from Beacon Point Lighthouse, and they had been very successful at it for more than 2 decades. The drive toward his new property was a gradual journey away from civilization and toward the wild, untamed edge of the continent. The Maine coastal highway gave way to a smaller state route, which in turn branched off onto a winding county road that hugged the rugged shoreline. With each mile, the signs of human habitation became fewer and farther between, replaced by dense stands of pine and spruce trees that seemed to press in on both sides of the narrow roadway. Ranger sat alert in the passenger seat, his nose pressed to the slightly open window as he catalogued the changing array of scents that marked their progress toward the sea. The dog's behavior was calm but attentive, his military training evident in the way he systematically scanned their surroundings for potential threats or points of interest. David found the turnoff to Beacon Point exactly where the county map indicated it should be, marked by 2 weathered wooden posts that had once supported a sign. The sign itself had long since disappeared, leaving only rusty metal fragments clinging to the rotting wood. The entrance looked like nothing more than an abandoned logging road, overgrown with brush and partially blocked by fallen branches. As David carefully maneuvered his truck onto the narrow track, his trained eyes began to notice inconsistencies that troubled him. The road was indeed in poor condition, with deep ruts carved by years of rain and neglect, but some of the obstacles seemed too perfectly placed to be entirely natural. A large fallen tree lay across the path at an angle that forced him to take a sharp detour around a particularly treacherous-looking washout. The positioning was such that any vehicle attempting to pass would be forced to slow to a crawl and navigate carefully around the hazard. Further along the track, a section of the road had been washed out by what appeared to be seasonal flooding, but the erosion pattern looked odd to David's experienced eye. It seemed too uniform, too complete, as if someone had helped the natural process along. These weren't the random obstacles of ordinary neglect, but rather a carefully constructed series of deterrents designed to discourage casual visitors. After 20 minutes of careful driving through what felt more like an obstacle course than a road, the track finally opened into a small clearing, and David got his first real look at his new home. The lighthouse stood before him like a sentinel from another era, its white-painted brick tower rising nearly 60 feet into the grey Maine sky. The structure was smaller than he had imagined, but more substantial, built from thick masonry blocks that had withstood more than a century of Atlantic storms. The lighthouse's condition was exactly as advertised, poor but not hopeless. The white paint was peeling and stained with rust from the metal fittings, and several windows near the base were boarded up with weathered plywood. The lantern room at the top was intact but dark, its massive lens assembly visible through salt-stained glass panels that had not seen cleaning in decades. Adjacent to the lighthouse, the foundation of what had once been the keeper's quarters was still visible, though the wooden structure itself had long since been removed or had collapsed. Only the stone foundation remained, creating a rectangular depression in the ground that was now filled with weeds and debris. David killed the engine and sat for a moment, taking in the full scope of what he had purchased. The lighthouse commanded a spectacular view of the Atlantic Ocean, perched on a rocky headland that jutted out into the restless waters like a stone finger pointing toward the horizon. The coastline here was dramatically beautiful, but obviously treacherous, with jagged rocks and hidden reefs extending far out into the deeper water. He and Ranger climbed out of the truck into air that was immediately different from what they had left behind in town. Here the salt breeze was constant and powerful, carrying with it the raw, elemental smell of the open ocean mixed with the earthy sense of the coastal forest. The sound was overwhelming at first, the continuous crash and hiss of waves against rocks, punctuated by the cries of seabirds and the whisper of wind through the evergreen trees that crowded close to the clearing. "Well, old friend," David said softly, the first words he had spoken since leaving town, "this is it. This is home." Ranger responded with a soft woof, his tail giving a cautious wag as he began his own inspection of their new territory. The dog moved with his characteristic alertness, nose to the ground, reading the countless scents that told the story of this place, the animals that had passed through, the history of weather and seasons, and perhaps most importantly, the absence of recent human presence. David approached the lighthouse itself, noting that while the main structure appeared sound, the heavy wooden door at the base was secured with a modern padlock that looked far newer than anything else on the property. This was puzzling, since the property had supposedly been abandoned for over 20 years. Who had installed this lock, and why? He tried the door handle anyway, knowing it would be locked but wanting to get a sense of the structure's condition. The door was solid and well fitted, suggesting that at least some maintenance had been performed even during the supposed years of abandonment. This was another piece of evidence that things at Beacon Point were not quite what they seemed. While David examined the lighthouse exterior, Ranger had begun his own systematic patrol of the immediate area. The dog moved in an expanding spiral pattern around the clearing, his nose working constantly as he processed the complex array of information available to his superior senses. His behavior was calm and methodical, the routine of a professional conducting a security sweep. It was as Ranger completed his initial circuit and returned to David's side that his demeanor suddenly changed. The dog had been moving past the base of the lighthouse tower when he stopped abruptly, every muscle in his body tensing. His head dropped low, and he began sniffing intensively at a particular section of the lighthouse's stone foundation. David watched as Ranger's tail went rigid and his ears flattened against his skull. A low whine began to emanate from deep in the dog's chest, a sound of deep unease that David had heard only a handful of times before. Each previous instance had preceded the discovery of something dangerous and hidden. "What is it, boy?" David asked, moving to join his companion at the base of the lighthouse. Ranger ignored the question, his entire focus concentrated on whatever he was detecting at ground level. He began to paw at the foundation stones, his claws scraping uselessly against the hard surface. The whine grew more urgent, more demanding, as if he were trying to communicate something of vital importance. David knelt beside his dog, running his hands over the stone foundation where Ranger's attention was focused. To his casual inspection, it looked like all the other sections of the lighthouse base, large, irregular stones mortared together with what appeared to be the original 19th century masonry work. But Ranger's senses were detecting something that human perception missed entirely. The dog's agitation continued to escalate. He backed away from the foundation, then returned, circling the area as if looking for a different approach to whatever problem he had identified. His behavior was becoming increasingly frantic, a sharp contrast to his usual calm professionalism. David had learned over their years of partnership to trust Ranger's instincts absolutely. The dog's senses were not only superior to human capabilities, but had been trained and refined through intensive military service. If Ranger believed there was something significant about this particular section of the lighthouse foundation, then David was prepared to take that assessment seriously. As the afternoon sun began to angle lower toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the rocky headland, David made a decision. Tomorrow he would return with the proper tools to investigate whatever had captured Ranger's attention so completely. Tonight, however, he wanted to spend some time researching the lighthouse's history and learning more about the mysterious Thomas Whitmore, the keeper who had vanished without a trace. The drive back to his temporary lodgings in town was completed in contemplative silence, with Ranger seeming to relax only gradually as they put distance between themselves and the lighthouse. David's mind was already working through the implications of what he had observed. The deliberately obstructed access road, the unexpectedly well-maintained security measures, and now Ranger's intense reaction to something hidden in the foundation stones. Everything suggested that Beacon Point Lighthouse was far from the abandoned, forgotten property it appeared to be. Someone had been taking care to keep visitors away, and someone had been maintaining at least minimal security. The question was who and what were they protecting? As David settled into his motel room that evening, spreading Earl Morrison's nautical charts across the small table and opening his laptop to begin researching the lighthouse's history, he felt the familiar stirring of purpose that had been absent from his life since leaving the military. He had come to Maine seeking peace and solitude, a quiet place to heal from the wounds of war and find his footing in civilian life. Instead, he had stumbled into a mystery that seemed to stretch back more than 2 decades, involving a missing person, a property that no one wanted to own, and secrets that someone had gone to considerable trouble to keep buried. For the first time since his discharge, David Hayes felt truly engaged with something beyond his own recovery. He glanced over at Ranger, who was lying on the floor beside the bed, but was not truly resting. The dog's eyes remained alert, occasionally flicking toward the window, as if he was still processing the sensory information he had gathered at the lighthouse. Whatever Ranger had detected in that foundation was significant enough that the dog was still thinking about it hours later. David opened his laptop and began typing Thomas Whitmore Lighthouse Keeper into the search engine. The investigation into Beacon Point's secrets was officially underway, and David had the distinct feeling that tomorrow's return visit would reveal far more than just an old lighthouse in need of renovation. The truth that someone had spent over 20 years trying to hide was finally going to have its day in the light. David woke before dawn to the sound of rain drumming against the motel room windows, a steady Atlantic downpour that seemed to have settled in for the long haul. He had spent most of the previous evening hunched over his laptop, following digital breadcrumbs that painted an increasingly troubling picture of Thomas Whitmore's disappearance and the subsequent history of Beacon Point Lighthouse. The research had kept him awake far longer than intended, but the information he had uncovered was too compelling to ignore. Ranger stirred from his position beside the bed, lifting his head to assess the weather conditions through the rain-streaked glass. The dog's expression seemed almost disapproving of the meteorological situation, as if he understood that their return to the lighthouse would be complicated by the storm. David checked his watch and noted it was barely 5:30 in the morning, but he felt fully alert despite the limited sleep. His military training had taught him to function effectively on minimal rest when circumstances demanded it. The hot shower in the motel's cramped bathroom provided a moment of warmth and clarity before facing the day ahead. As the scalding water washed away the last remnants of sleep, David reviewed the disturbing facts he had assembled during his late-night research session. Thomas Whitmore had indeed been the final keeper of Beacon Point Lighthouse, a position he had held for nearly 15 years before his unexplained disappearance in 1994. The man had been described by those who knew him as reliable, methodical, and deeply committed to his duties as a guardian of maritime safety. What made Whitmore's vanishing particularly unsettling was the complete absence of any logical explanation. He had not been experiencing financial difficulties, personal problems, or health issues that might have motivated him to simply walk away from his life. His truck had been found with the keys in the ignition and his personal belongings still inside his quarters, as if he had stepped outside for a routine task and simply never returned. The Coast Guard investigation had been thorough but ultimately fruitless, concluding that Whitmore's fate would likely remain a mystery. More troubling still were the patterns David had discovered in the maritime accident records for the waters around Beacon Point. In the decades before Whitmore's disappearance, the rocky coastline had certainly claimed its share of vessels, but the incidents had followed predictable patterns related to severe weather conditions or mechanical failures. After 1994, however, the accident rate had increased dramatically, with experienced mariners running aground in conditions that should have presented no unusual challenges. The local Coast Guard station had been quietly expressing concerns about these incidents for years, noting that many of the affected vessels had been equipped with modern navigation equipment that should have prevented such mishaps. Yet the official reports consistently attributed the accidents to pilot error or equipment failure, explanations that seemed increasingly inadequate given the frequency and similarity of the incidents. David dressed quickly in waterproof gear, knowing that his investigation of Ranger's discovery would require spending considerable time exposed to the elements. He packed his tools carefully in a waterproof duffel bag: crowbars, chisels, a battery-powered drill, and a powerful LED lantern that would provide adequate illumination in any conditions. He also included a digital camera to document whatever they might find, along with evidence bags in case they uncovered anything that required careful preservation. The drive back to Beacon Point through the morning storm was treacherous, with the narrow coastal roads slick with rain and debris blown down from the surrounding forests. Visibility was reduced to mere yards in some sections, forcing David to navigate primarily by memory and the occasional glimpse of familiar landmarks. Ranger rode silently in the passenger seat, his attention focused intently on the route ahead as if he were mentally preparing for whatever awaited them at their destination. When they finally reached the turnoff to the lighthouse property, David was struck by how different the access road appeared in the stormy conditions. What had seemed like merely poor maintenance the previous day now looked actively hostile, with standing water filling every depression and loose rocks scattered across the narrow track. Several times he was forced to stop and clear fallen branches that had been brought down by the wind, and he began to suspect that some of these obstacles were not as randomly placed as they appeared. The lighthouse itself loomed out of the rain and mist like a ghost ship emerging from fog, its white tower barely visible against the grey sky until they were almost upon it. The storm had transformed the surrounding landscape into something primordial and forbidding, with the ocean crashing violently against the rocky headland and sending spray high into the air. The constant roar of wind and waves created an almost overwhelming acoustic environment that seemed to swallow all other sounds. David parked the truck as close to the lighthouse as possible and gathered his equipment, knowing that every moment spent outside would be a battle against the elements. Ranger emerged from the vehicle with obvious reluctance, his usually eager demeanor replaced by a focused determination to complete whatever mission they had come to accomplish. The dog immediately trotted toward the section of foundation that had captured his attention the previous day, as if the intervening hours had only sharpened his sense of purpose. Even in the harsh conditions, Ranger's behavior at the foundation stones was unmistakably urgent. He pressed his nose close to the masonry, his body language conveying the same intense focus David had witnessed during their military service when the dog had detected hidden explosives or weapons caches. The rain seemed to enhance rather than diminish whatever scent signature Ranger was following, and his agitation quickly escalated to the same frantic pawing and whining that had marked their previous visit. David knelt beside his partner, pulling out his most powerful flashlight and directing its beam along the foundation where Ranger's attention was concentrated. In the harsh LED illumination, details became visible that had been obscured by the softer afternoon light of their previous visit. The mortar between several of the foundation stones showed subtle but distinct differences in color and texture, suggesting that this section had been disturbed and repaired at some point after the original construction. More significantly, David could now see that the stones themselves were not quite as perfectly fitted as they had initially appeared. There were hairline gaps in several joints, and what he had previously taken for natural weathering now looked more like the careful work of someone who had removed and replaced these particular stones with considerable skill. The craftsmanship was excellent, but it was definitely not original to the lighthouse's 19th-century construction. Working methodically despite the driving rain, David began to probe the suspicious mortar joints with a thin-bladed chisel. The material was harder than he had expected, but as he worked it became clear that this was indeed a later repair, probably completed within the last few decades rather than during the lighthouse's original construction period. The mortar came away in small chunks, revealing that the stones behind it were not as securely seated as they should have been. Ranger remained pressed close to his side throughout the process, occasionally whimpering with what seemed like encouragement or urgency. The dog's behavior suggested that whatever lay behind these stones was significant enough to justify the considerable effort required to reach it. David trusted that assessment completely, drawing on years of experience that had taught him to rely on his partner's superior senses even when he could not understand the nature of what was being detected. After nearly an hour of careful work, David had loosened enough mortar to attempt moving one of the larger foundation stones. The block was heavier than he had anticipated, requiring multiple attempts with the crowbar before it finally shifted. When it did move, it revealed not solid earth or the lighthouse's original foundation work, but rather a carefully constructed cavity that had been deliberately concealed behind the stone facade. The space was larger than David had expected, extending back into the foundation for several feet and lined with what appeared to be metal sheeting to protect its contents from moisture. His flashlight beam revealed the interior of what was clearly an intentionally created hiding place, one that had been designed to keep its contents safe from both the elements and casual discovery. The metal work showed signs of careful maintenance, suggesting that this cache had been accessed and tended to on a regular basis even during the lighthouse's supposed years of abandonment. Inside the hidden compartment, David could make out several distinct objects. The most prominent was a large military-style waterproof case, the kind used to protect sensitive equipment or documents in harsh field conditions. Beside it sat a smaller metal box that looked like a cashier's strongbox, its surface scarred but intact. Several thick manila envelopes were visible, their contents creating bulky, irregular shapes that suggested photographs or documents. Most intriguingly, there were what appeared to be several small glass vials or specimen containers, each carefully wrapped in protective material. David felt his pulse quicken as he realized the magnitude of what Ranger had led him to discover. This was not simply an old hiding place or forgotten storage area, but rather a carefully maintained cache that someone had been using as recently as the past few years. The condition of the materials and the sophisticated nature of the concealment suggested that this was connected to something far more significant than a missing lighthouse keeper's personal effects. He carefully photographed the cache in its original state before beginning the delicate process of removing its contents. The waterproof case was the largest and heaviest item, requiring considerable effort to maneuver out of the confined space. When he finally managed to extract it and set it on the ground beside the lighthouse, he could see that it bore official markings indicating it was government surplus equipment, probably Coast Guard or military in origin. The smaller strongbox came out more easily, though its weight suggested it contained either documents or possibly electronic equipment. The manila envelopes were more fragile, their paper surfaces showing the effects of years in storage despite the protection of the metal-lined cache. David handled them with extreme care, knowing that whatever they contained was likely to be both valuable and irreplaceable. The glass vials presented a particular challenge, as they were obviously designed to contain some form of liquid or chemical samples that could be compromised by rough handling. David counted at least a dozen of them, each individually wrapped and labeled with what appeared to be dates and location coordinates. The precision of the labeling and the professional nature of the storage suggested these were scientific samples of some kind, collected and preserved according to strict protocols. By the time David had removed all the contents of the cache, he was soaked to the skin despite his waterproof gear, and both he and Ranger were eager to get out of the storm. He loaded everything carefully into his truck, taking extra precautions to ensure that nothing would be damaged during the drive back to town. Ranger jumped into the passenger seat with obvious relief, shaking himself vigorously to shed the accumulated rainwater from his thick coat. The drive back to the motel was accomplished in contemplative silence, with David's mind racing through the implications of their discovery. The cache had obviously been maintained by someone who possessed both the knowledge of its existence and regular access to the lighthouse property. The sophistication of the concealment and the nature of the stored materials suggested that this was connected to something far more serious than simple personal effects or sentimental keepsakes. Back in the relative warmth and security of his motel room, David spread his discoveries across the small table and began a systematic examination of each item. He started with the manila envelopes, which proved to contain an extensive collection of photographs, documents, and handwritten notes. The photographs were particularly striking, showing various sections of the Maine coastline under different lighting conditions and weather patterns. Many of them featured ships or boats in distress, captured in the moments before or during grounding incidents on the rocky shores. The documents were more complex and troubling. They included official Coast Guard incident reports, navigation charts marked with detailed annotations, and correspondence between various maritime authorities regarding the unusual pattern of accidents near Beacon Point. Most significantly, there were several letters bearing Thomas Whitmore's signature, written in a careful, methodical hand and dated just weeks before his disappearance. In these letters, Whitmore detailed his growing concerns about what he described as artificial navigation hazards that were causing experienced mariners to run aground in waters they should have been able to navigate safely. He wrote about discovering evidence of deliberate signal interference that was disrupting vessels' electronic navigation systems, causing them to misread their position relative to the dangerous rocks that surrounded the lighthouse's rocky perch. More disturbing still were Whitmore's observations about the timing of these incidents. He had noted that the navigation disruptions seemed to occur primarily when certain types of vessels were passing through the area, specifically boats that were carrying what appeared to be sensitive cargo or passengers who might prefer to avoid official scrutiny. The pattern suggested that someone was using the lighthouse's strategic position to selectively disable vessels that met particular criteria. Whitmore's final letters expressed his intention to document this activity more thoroughly and to report his findings to federal authorities who would have the resources to conduct a proper investigation. He wrote about hidden observation equipment he had installed around the lighthouse and about samples he had collected from vessels that had been affected by the mysterious navigation problems. These final communications suggested that he had identified not only the method being used to cause the groundings, but also the individuals responsible for the operation. David turned his attention to the waterproof case, which proved to require a combination lock to open. However, after several attempts using dates from Whitmore's letters, he was successful in opening the mechanism. Inside, he found sophisticated electronic equipment that was clearly more advanced than anything that would have been available to a lighthouse keeper in 1994. The devices appeared to be signal generators and radio frequency jammers, equipment that could indeed cause the kind of navigation disruptions that Whitmore had described in his letters. Along with the electronic equipment, the case contained detailed technical manuals and installation guides, as well as maintenance logs that showed the devices had been regularly serviced and updated over the years since Whitmore's disappearance. The most recent entries in these logs were dated just 6 months earlier, conclusive proof that someone had continued to operate and maintain this equipment long after the lighthouse had supposedly been abandoned. The strongbox revealed its contents more reluctantly, requiring David to use his lock-picking skills learned during military training. Inside, he discovered what appeared to be financial records documenting payments received for services that were described only in coded language. The amounts were substantial, ranging from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of dollars, and they had been received on a regular basis for more than 2 decades. More significantly, the financial records included correspondence with offshore banking institutions and shell companies that suggested a sophisticated money laundering operation. The transactions were carefully structured to avoid triggering federal reporting requirements, and the paper trail had been deliberately obscured through multiple intermediaries and jurisdictions.
The glass vials proved to contain water samples that had been collected from various locations around Beacon Point, each one carefully labeled with GPS coordinates and timestamps.
When David cross-referenced these locations with the nautical charts he had obtained from Earl Morrison, he realized that the samples had been taken from the exact spots where vessels had run aground over the past 20 years. The systematic nature of the collection suggested that someone had been conducting an ongoing environmental assessment of the accident sites. As David assembled all of this evidence into a coherent picture, the true scope of what had been happening at Beacon Point became clear. Thomas Whitmore had not simply disappeared. He had been eliminated because he had discovered a long-running criminal operation that was using the lighthouse's strategic position to selectively target vessels for hijacking or worse. The missing keeper had been replaced by someone who could continue to operate the sophisticated equipment needed to disrupt ship navigation systems while maintaining the appearance that the lighthouse was abandoned and forgotten. The operation was clearly ongoing, with regular maintenance of the electronic equipment and continued collection of environmental samples from the accident sites. The financial records suggested that whoever was running this operation was being paid substantial amounts by clients who benefited from having specific vessels disabled in the treacherous waters around the lighthouse. David realized that his purchase of the property had likely disrupted a criminal enterprise that had been operating successfully for more than 2 decades. The reactions he had encountered from locals, the deliberately obstructed access road, and the general atmosphere of fear surrounding the lighthouse were not the product of superstition, but rather the result of a carefully orchestrated campaign to keep people away from a site that was being used for illegal activities. The question now was what to do with this information. David's military training told him that he was likely dealing with people who had already demonstrated their willingness to commit murder to protect their operation. Thomas Whitmore's disappearance had been carefully planned and executed to look like an unexplained vanishing, but the evidence suggested that the lighthouse keeper had been killed because he posed a threat to a lucrative criminal enterprise. As the afternoon storm began to intensify outside his motel room windows, David carefully repacked all the evidence and considered his options. He could turn everything over to federal authorities immediately, but his experience with military bureaucracy made him reluctant to trust that the information would be acted upon quickly or effectively. He could also try to gather additional evidence to strengthen the case, but that would require returning to the lighthouse and potentially exposing himself to whoever was still operating the criminal enterprise. Ranger had been lying quietly beside the table throughout David's examination of the evidence, but as evening approached, the dog's behavior began to change in ways that David recognized as significant. The German shepherd's ears kept swiveling toward the motel room door, and his posture gradually shifted from relaxed alertness to something approaching combat readiness. The dog was detecting something that suggested they were no longer alone in their investigation. David quietly moved to the window and peered through the rain-streaked glass at the motel parking lot below. At first, everything appeared normal, with only a few vehicles belonging to other guests scattered across the wet asphalt. But as he watched more carefully, he began to notice details that troubled him. A dark sedan parked near the far edge of the lot had been running its engine for an unusually long time, its exhaust visible in the cool evening air. The vehicle's occupants were not visible, but the car's positioning gave its occupants a clear view of David's room. More concerning still was the behavior of a maintenance worker who had been moving around the motel grounds for the past hour, ostensibly performing routine repairs, but actually spending far too much time in the vicinity of David's truck. The man's movements were too purposeful, too focused on David's vehicle, to be entirely innocent. When the worker bent down beside the truck as if examining something underneath, David's military instincts told him that his vehicle was being prepared for sabotage or surveillance. The realization that he was now under observation fundamentally changed the nature of his situation. Whoever was behind the lighthouse operation had identified him as a threat and was taking steps to monitor and possibly eliminate him.
The same people who had made Thomas Whitmore disappear without a trace were now focusing their attention on the Marine veteran who had unknowingly disrupted their long-running criminal enterprise. David quickly gathered his equipment and the evidence from the cache, knowing that staying in the motel was no longer safe. He needed to find a secure location where he could properly document everything he had discovered and develop a plan for getting the information to authorities who could act on it effectively. But first he had to escape the surveillance that was already in place around him. Ranger seemed to understand the urgency of the situation, moving quietly to the door and taking up a position where he could monitor the hallway for approaching threats. The dog's military training was evident in his focused alertness and his positioning to provide maximum tactical advantage should they need to fight their way out of the building. As David prepared to leave, he reflected on how dramatically his life had changed in just 2 days. He had come to Maine seeking nothing more than a quiet place to heal from the wounds of war and build a simple, peaceful life. Instead, he had stumbled into a mystery that stretched back more than 2 decades and involved people who were willing to commit murder to protect their secrets. The lighthouse that he had purchased for $800 was turning out to be the most expensive real estate transaction of his life. But David Hayes was not a man who backed down from challenges, especially when those challenges involved protecting innocent people from criminals who had been operating with impunity for far too long. Thomas Whitmore had died trying to expose this operation, and countless mariners had lost their lives or livelihoods because of the artificial navigation hazards that were being created around Beacon Point. Someone needed to finish what the missing lighthouse keeper had started, and David was beginning to accept that he might be the only person in a position to do so. The storm continued to rage outside as David and Ranger prepared to disappear into the night, carrying with them the evidence that could finally bring justice for Thomas Whitmore and put an end to the criminal enterprise that had turned a historic lighthouse into an instrument of maritime terror. The real battle was about to begin. The narrow service road behind the motel was barely more than an alley, used primarily for deliveries and maintenance access. David had scouted it during his initial arrival, a habit ingrained by years of military training that demanded knowing all available escape routes from any position. Now that foresight was proving invaluable, as he and Ranger slipped out through the motel's rear exit, carrying the critical evidence in a waterproof backpack that had seen action in 3 different combat zones. The rain had diminished to a steady drizzle, but the overcast sky provided natural camouflage as they moved through the shadows behind the building. David's truck remained under surveillance in the main parking lot, but he had no intention of returning to it. Instead, he had formulated a plan that would take advantage of his adversary's assumption that he was trapped in his room, unaware of their presence. Ranger moved with perfect silence beside him, the dog's training evident in every careful step. They navigated through the maze of service buildings and storage areas that comprised the motel's operational infrastructure, staying well clear of the main facilities where their movements might be detected. David's destination was a 24-hour diner 3 blocks away, a place where he could blend in with late-night travelers while using the establishment's Wi-Fi to upload copies of Whitmore's evidence to secure servers. The diner was exactly the kind of anonymous roadside establishment that catered to truckers, night shift workers, and insomniacs seeking coffee and companionship in the small hours. Its neon sign cast a welcoming glow through the misty darkness, and the interior was warm and bright enough to provide both security and functionality. David selected a corner booth that offered clear sight lines to all entrances while positioning Ranger underneath the table where the dog could monitor the restaurant's atmosphere for signs of trouble. The waitress, a middle-aged woman whose name tag identified her as Linda, brought coffee without being asked and seemed genuinely pleased to have customers during what was obviously a slow shift. Her casual friendliness provided perfect cover as David opened his laptop and began the methodical process of digitizing and uploading every piece of evidence they had recovered from the lighthouse cache. The photographs of ships in distress, Whitmore's detailed correspondence, the financial records, and the technical specifications of the jamming equipment all went into encrypted files that were simultaneously uploaded to multiple secure locations. David had learned during his military service never to rely on a single point of failure when dealing with critical intelligence, and the evidence of the lighthouse conspiracy was certainly that. As he worked, David composed a detailed summary of everything he had discovered, including his analysis of how the criminal operation functioned and his assessment of the ongoing threat it represented to maritime safety. This document went to 3 different recipients: a federal prosecutor he had worked with on a previous case involving military contractors, an investigative journalist whose work he respected, and a contact at the Coast Guard who had the authority to initiate immediate action if the circumstances warranted it. The process took nearly 2 hours, during which Linda refilled his coffee cup 4 times and brought Ranger a bowl of water without comment. The diner remained quiet except for a handful of truckers who came and went without paying any attention to the man and dog in the corner booth. By 3:30 in the morning, David had completed his digital insurance policy, ensuring that the truth about Beacon Point would survive even if he did not. The return journey to the lighthouse was going to be the most dangerous part of his plan, but it was also absolutely necessary. The evidence he had uploaded was compelling, but it would be even more effective if he could document the criminal operation in action. More importantly, he suspected that his discovery of the cache would prompt the criminals to accelerate their timeline, possibly attempting to eliminate all evidence of their activities before disappearing to establish their operation elsewhere. David paid his bill and left the diner through the rear entrance, beginning the careful process of making his way back to where he had hidden his truck behind an abandoned gas station 6 blocks from the motel. The rain had stopped entirely, but the overcast sky provided continuing cover as he moved through the empty streets of the coastal town. Ranger remained alert but relaxed, his behavior suggesting that they had successfully evaded the surveillance that had been monitoring the motel. The drive back to Beacon Point was accomplished without headlights for the first several miles, relying on David's night vision and intimate familiarity with the route. Only when he was well clear of the town did he risk using the vehicle's lighting system, and even then he kept the beams dimmed to avoid detection by anyone who might be watching the access roads. The turnoff to the lighthouse property appeared different in the pre-dawn darkness, more forbidding and primitive than it had seemed during his previous visits. David parked his truck nearly a mile from the lighthouse itself, concealing it in a grove of pine trees where it would be invisible from both the access road and the ocean. The final approach would have to be made on foot, carrying the equipment he would need to document whatever was happening at the lighthouse. Ranger seemed to understand the gravity of their mission, moving with the disciplined silence of a combat veteran as they made their way through the dense coastal forest toward their target. The sound of the ocean grew steadily louder as they approached the lighthouse, but it was not the only noise that reached their ears. David could detect the subtle hum of electronic equipment, confirmation that the jamming devices were currently active and targeting vessels in the surrounding waters. More significantly, there were voices coming from the direction of the lighthouse, at least 3 different men engaged in what sounded like an urgent conversation. David and Ranger took up position in the tree line at the edge of the clearing, using the natural camouflage of the forest to observe the activity around the lighthouse without being detected themselves. The scene that greeted them was far more sophisticated than David had expected. A large panel van was parked beside the lighthouse, its rear doors open to reveal an array of electronic monitoring equipment that was obviously being used to coordinate the criminal operation. 2 men were working with this equipment, while a third stood near the lighthouse entrance, apparently serving as a lookout. David recognized the lookout as the maintenance worker who had been tampering with his truck at the motel, confirmation that the same organization was responsible for both the lighthouse operation and the surveillance he had evaded. The man was armed with what appeared to be a military-style rifle and was scanning the surrounding area with night vision equipment, demonstrating a level of professionalism that suggested these were not ordinary criminals. The conversation between the three men was just audible over the sound of the ocean, and what David could hear was deeply troubling. They were discussing a vessel that was currently approaching the dangerous waters around Beacon Point, apparently unaware that its navigation systems were about to be compromised. The ship was described as carrying a cargo that would be particularly valuable, and the criminals were coordinating their jamming sequence to ensure it would run aground at precisely the location where they could access it most easily. David realized he was witnessing the lighthouse conspiracy in real time, watching as these men prepared to cause a deliberate maritime disaster for profit.
The vessel they were targeting would soon find its electronic navigation systems failing, leaving its crew to navigate by sight alone through some of the most treacherous waters on the East Coast. In the darkness and poor visibility of the early morning hours, the chances of avoiding the hidden reefs and rocky outcroppings would be minimal. Using his cell phone's camera, David began documenting the scene, capturing clear images of the men, their equipment, and their license plates. The digital timestamps would provide crucial evidence of the criminal operation's activities, and the images would allow law enforcement to identify and prosecute everyone involved. But documentation alone would not be sufficient to prevent the immediate disaster that was unfolding. David faced an impossible choice. He could maintain his concealed position and continue gathering evidence while innocent mariners were deliberately placed in mortal danger, or he could intervene to prevent the disaster, but likely lose his life in the process. The three criminals were obviously well armed and prepared for trouble, while he had only his military training and ranger's support. The decision was made for him when the sound of a ship's horn echoed across the water, indicating that the targeted vessel was now close enough to be affected by the jamming equipment. David could see lights on the horizon that marked the ship's position, and he knew that within minutes its crew would discover that their navigation systems were no longer functioning properly. In the treacherous waters around Beacon Point, that discovery would likely come too late to prevent a grounding. David whispered a command to Ranger, and the dog immediately understood that they were transitioning from surveillance to direct action. The German shepherd's posture shifted from alert observation to combat readiness, his training allowing him to adapt instantly to the changed tactical situation. They had worked together in similar circumstances before, though never with stakes quite this personal. Moving with the stealth that had kept them alive through multiple combat deployments, David began to circle around the clearing to approach the lighthouse from the opposite side. His plan was to disable the jamming equipment, while Ranger created a distraction that would draw the criminals' attention away from their electronic warfare operation. It was a desperate gambit, but the alternative was to allow innocent people to die while he remained safely hidden in the trees. The approach took nearly 20 minutes, with David moving from tree to tree and using every bit of cover the landscape provided. Ranger paralleled his movement, staying low and taking advantage of his natural camouflage to remain invisible to the criminals' night vision equipment. By the time they reached their attack position, the ship's lights were clearly visible offshore, and David could hear the increasing urgency in the criminals' voices as they coordinated their assault on the vessel's navigation systems. The jamming equipment was more sophisticated than anything David had encountered during his military service, consisting of multiple transmitters that were obviously capable of overwhelming a ship's GPS receivers and electronic chart systems. The devices were being operated remotely from the van, but David could see that they were vulnerable to physical intervention if he could reach them without being detected. The moment of action came when one of the criminals moved away from the lighthouse to check on something near the van, leaving only two men actively monitoring the operation. David signaled to Ranger, and the dog immediately began executing his part of the plan. The German shepherd emerged from the forest on the far side of the clearing, deliberately making enough noise to attract the attention of the lookout, while staying far enough away to avoid immediate capture. The ruse worked perfectly.
The lookout called out an alarm and began moving toward Ranger's position, drawing the second criminal away from his monitoring station. David seized the opportunity to sprint across the open ground toward the jamming equipment, knowing that he had perhaps 30 seconds before the criminals realized they were facing a coordinated attack rather than a random intrusion by a wild animal. Reaching the array of electronic devices, David began systematically destroying everything he could reach, using his crowbar to smash circuit boards and sever power cables. The jamming signals ceased immediately, and he could see lights on the offshore vessel change course as its crew regained control of their navigation systems. The immediate crisis had been averted, but David's position was now completely exposed. The criminals' response was swift and violent. Gunfire erupted from multiple positions around the clearing as they attempted to eliminate the threat that had just disrupted their operation. David threw himself behind the van, using its bulk as cover while he assessed the tactical situation. Ranger had disappeared back into the forest, but David could hear him moving through the underbrush, maintaining pressure on the criminals' flank and preventing them from concentrating all their fire on David's position. The firefight that followed was brief but intense, with David drawing on every survival skill he had acquired during his military career. His knowledge of the terrain, combined with Ranger's harassment of the criminals' positions, gradually shifted the tactical balance in their favor. One by one, the criminals were forced to abandon their coordinated positions and retreat toward their vehicle. The decisive moment came when David managed to disable the van by shooting out its tires and puncturing its radiator, trapping the criminals at the lighthouse with no means of escape. With their electronic equipment destroyed and their transportation disabled, they were left with no choice but to surrender or fight to the death. Faced with the prospect of a prolonged gun battle against a trained military veteran and his combat-experienced dog, they chose surrender. As the sun began to rise over the Atlantic Ocean, painting the lighthouse and its surrounding headland in shades of gold and crimson, the sound of approaching helicopters announced the arrival of federal law enforcement. David's uploads from the diner had triggered an immediate response from multiple agencies, and the evidence he had provided had been sufficient to authorize a full-scale operation against the maritime conspiracy. Agent Sarah Chen of the FBI emerged from the lead helicopter, her professional demeanor immediately establishing her authority over the scene. She surveyed the disabled jamming equipment, the captured criminals, and the extensive evidence David had collected, nodding with obvious satisfaction at the thoroughness of the case he had built. "Mr. Hayes," she said, extending her hand in greeting, "you've done exceptional work here. The evidence you provided allowed us to coordinate with international maritime authorities and identify at least 6 other locations where similar operations were being conducted. This conspiracy was much larger than anyone suspected." David accepted her congratulations while keeping one eye on Ranger, who was conducting his own inspection of the captured criminals to ensure they posed no continuing threat. The dog's behavior suggested that the immediate danger had passed, but his alertness indicated that he remained ready for further action if circumstances required it. Agent Chen continued her briefing as her team began processing the crime scene. "The financial records you found led us to a network of shell companies that were being used to launder the proceeds from dozens of ship hijackings over the past 2 decades. The environmental samples you recovered will help us identify other locations where vessels were deliberately grounded, and the electronic equipment provides proof of the methods being used to cause these incidents." She gestured toward the lighthouse, its white tower now gleaming in the morning sunlight. "Thomas Whitmore's investigation was more comprehensive than we initially realized. His disappearance wasn't just murder, it was the elimination of a federal informant who had been working with the Coast Guard to expose this conspiracy. His death will finally receive the justice it deserved." As the day progressed and the crime scene processing continued, David found himself reflecting on the extraordinary chain of events that had led him from seeking simple solitude to uncovering one of the most sophisticated maritime criminal conspirations in recent history. The lighthouse that he had purchased for $800 had indeed changed his destiny, though not in any way he could have anticipated. The media attention that followed was intense but brief, with David maintaining a low profile while federal prosecutors built their cases against the captured criminals and their associates. The financial network behind the conspiracy proved to extend into multiple countries and involve dozens of individuals, making it one of the largest maritime crime prosecutions in decades. 6 months later, David stood once again on the rocky headland beside Beacon Point Lighthouse, but the scene was dramatically transformed. The lighthouse itself had been restored to full operational status as part of a federal historic preservation initiative, its beacon once again serving its original purpose of guiding mariners safely through the dangerous waters that surrounded the rocky peninsula. The keeper's quarters had been rebuilt according to the original 19th-century plans, creating a comfortable residence that honored the lighthouse's maritime heritage while incorporating modern amenities and security features. David had moved into the restored building permanently, accepting an offer from the Coast Guard to serve as the lighthouse's official keeper and maintenance coordinator. Ranger had adapted to their new life with characteristic enthusiasm, establishing himself as the unofficial guardian of the lighthouse and its surrounding grounds. The dog's daily patrols of the property ensured that no unauthorized activities could take place without detection, while his presence provided David with the companionship and security that had proven so valuable during their investigation of the criminal conspiracy. The work of maintaining the lighthouse and coordinating with maritime authorities provided David with exactly the kind of purposeful but peaceful existence he had been seeking when he first came to Maine. The isolation and natural beauty of the location offered healing for the psychological wounds of military service, while the responsibility of ensuring maritime safety gave him a sense of mission that connected him to something larger than himself. Earl Morrison from the Marine Supply Store had become a regular visitor, bringing supplies and sharing stories about the lighthouse's long history of service to the maritime community. The old sailor's initial warnings about the property had been replaced by genuine admiration for David's role in exposing the conspiracy and restoring the lighthouse to its proper function. "You know," Earl said during one of his visits, standing beside David on the lighthouse gallery and looking out over the vast expanse of the Atlantic, "Tom Whitmore would be proud of what you've accomplished here. He spent 15 years keeping mariners safe from these waters, and now his work is going to continue for generations to come." David nodded, feeling the truth of Earl's words in the salt breeze that carried the scent of the ocean and the cries of seabirds. Thomas Whitmore's sacrifice had not been in vain, and the lighthouse that had been turned into an instrument of criminal conspiracy was once again serving its original purpose as a beacon of safety and hope. As the sun set over the Maine coast, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, David climbed to the top of the lighthouse and activated the powerful beacon that would guide vessels safely through the night. Ranger took up his customary position beside the light, ready to alert his partner to any unusual activity in the waters below. The lighthouse beam swept across the darkening ocean in its steady rotation, a symbol of vigilance and protection that had been restored to its rightful purpose. David Hayes had found far more than the peace and solitude he had been seeking when he answered that obscure auction listing. He had found his calling, his home, and his place in a tradition of service that stretched back more than a century. The mystery of Beacon Point Lighthouse had been solved, its criminals brought to justice, and its beacon restored to guide mariners safely home. Sometimes the most important discoveries came not from seeking them deliberately, but from having the courage to follow where loyalty and instinct led, even when the path was shrouded in darkness and danger. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.